And my greatest fear right now in dealing with what you are calling polycrisis, okay, and I love that word, I think stems from epic change. And the problem that I have and the worry is that we're going to go back to what used to work and solve for how the world was instead of what it is becoming. So that's the question. What is the world becoming?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Michael. And welcome everybody for today's webinar. My name is Stanley Wu, and I'm the coordinator for Omega and the director of the Resilience Project at Commonweal. And Omega is a collaborative working on the global polycrisis and includes the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere at Stanford, the Kranz Foresight Analysis Nexus, or the FAN Initiative, the New School, and the Resilience Project. We're delighted today to be joined by Philip Yoon, a global thought leader with over 35 years of leadership experience in security affairs, nuclear nonproliferation, diplomacy, international development, law, business, and philanthropy. The conversation will be facilitated, but none other by Michael Lerner. And a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box to both panelists and attendees. We will get to as many questions as we are able to. And also please note that this webinar will be recorded and posted to the Omega website. Now, without further ado, Michael Lerner.
Thank you, Stanley, so much. Philip Yoon, we're so delighted to have you here. Joan Diamond will introduce you in just a moment. Let me just introduce Joan briefly. She has been part of our work on polycrisis resilience at Omega and the Resilience Funders Network from its inception. And as you well know, she is the director of the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, and also is responsible for the FAN Initiative, and really has brought such depth of experience and wisdom to our work that we are forever grateful for it. So with that, Joan, I will turn it over to you to introduce Philip.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. And everyone, greetings and thank you all for joining us today. Today's Omega Collaborative will be a journey into the polycrisis navigated by Philip Yoon. Philip comes to us not only with a distinguished career in multiple dimensions of our shared human predicament, but with observations, questions, challenges for us to pursue together. He is, using his word, an aggregator, a man who has worked on the ground in many components of our challenging future, a man who has used this experience to cultivate wisdom, who listens carefully to diverse global views, bringing to the process humility while identifying new questions for those concerned about what's ahead. Over the past 35 years, Philip has approached global challenges as a scholar, as a senior political advisor in the East Asia Bureau in the State Department in the Clinton administration, been sought after as an expert on North Korea, which is how I first met him, been a practicing attorney in international law, worked in private equity firm investing in Asia, been deeply engaged in international policy development and domestic political activism. Since 2000, he has focused primarily on philanthropy as executive director and COO of the Ploughshares Fund, San Francisco, the largest nuclear weapons nonproliferation foundation in the US, and as vice president of the Asia Foundation. Currently, he is president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. For those unfamiliar with the World Affairs Council, which I first joined, I'm lapsed 55 years ago in high school, but was very instrumental in my development. The council is based on the belief that solutions to the world's most challenging problems are found when the private, philanthropic, and public sectors work together. There are few people with the on-the-ground experience in philanthropy, senior level public sector service, and the private sector than Philip Yoon. It is with great pleasure that I turn the session over to Philip.
Joan, thank you so much. I am very humbled by being here. I can't say no to you, so I welcome you. Welcome, and thank you for bringing me here to this particular webinar. Wanted to thank the Resilience Funders Network, Omega, and Commonweal. So, you know, I'll have to confess, I had a lot of trepidation coming here and agreeing to do this particular program. You know, when I heard your introduction, Joan, something came immediately to me, what I tell my staff when they first come to me. And I think it really applies here. I tell people, don't assume I know what I'm talking about, okay? What attracted me to becoming here was just because of all of you here in terms of what you've been doing and the deep thought that you have been giving to this particular problem that I've been giving to for the last 10 years or so. And I'm really looking up front here as this is a conversation. You know, if you're here for a prediction about the future or some special insight or encompassing theory change, I think you guys are all going to be very disappointed. Instead, you know, what I do, and I do in my office, I think, is I'm the one who has all the questions, right? And the questions that we have and I have here are really hard ones. And so what I thought I would do with the few minutes that I've got here is to share with you how I got to those questions. And in certain ways, I look forward to telling me why I'm wrong, because I'd like to be wrong on some of this stuff. So let's start off right now with a question which I will come back to all of you, and maybe what you can do is do it in the chat. This is a question that I ask a lot of people. Do you think the world is a mess, or do you think it's messy? All right. I remember when I asked the staff, I asked how many people think it's a mess. Some people say this, other people say messy. And then I asked how many people think you can't tell the difference, and pretty much everyone raises the question. So I will come back to that at the end, but just keep that in mind, and maybe you can sort of throw that around to yourselves in the chat. So for those of you who believe the world is a mess or messy, you have a lot to point to. I mean, you know, if nothing else, the last 2 years have shown that you know, we are in a very different world now than we were perhaps a generation ago. I mean, you've got, you know, at the local, national, international, transnational level, you've got just incredible things that are happening, right? At the transnational level, we've got pandemic, we've got climate change. At the international level, we have Russia and Ukraine. The way the world worked for the previous 50 years no longer applies. You have at the national level, you know, January 6th. I mean, we're hearing about this right now in terms of what happened, how close we were to losing our democracy. And at the local level, if you're here in San Francisco, when you see all the craziness that's going on in terms of local crime, in terms of homelessness, you know, if you have no doubt before, the world that we thought, we will never go back to what we thought was normal over a decade ago. I mean, that's just the way it is, okay? And my greatest fear right now in dealing with what you are calling polycrisis, okay? And I love that word. I think stems from epic change. And the problem that I have and the worry is that we're gonna go back to what used to work and solve for how the world was instead of what it is becoming. So that's the question. What is the world becoming? So what's the best illustration of this phenomenon? I think a lot of people, all of you will be very familiar. I mean, we talked about World War I. The generals of pre-World War I Europe made plans based on wars of the past, which had nothing to do with the realities of what World War I actually was. So with this fundamental belief in mind, what I'm going to argue right now or throw out for you to consider as I go through these arguments, through my thought process, is that for those of you who are concerned about polycrisis, I think one of the most important considerations that in my world, I don't see people thinking about. They're focused on obviously climate crisis. They're thought about, you know, where democracy is. They're thought about, you know, the various issues that we have all through these various levels. I think that there has to be a lot of attention being paid to also thinking about a new narrative and origin story, okay? It's really, I think that's really important, and I'll explain why. It's a new origin story about who we are, where we want to go, and what we want to become. Okay, now I know that's a pretty big stretch. Maybe, I'm hoping that some of you have thought about this. Maybe you haven't, but this is something that is constantly coming back to me. So here's what I will do very quickly. And again, you all are guinea pigs for me in the sense that I've never made this kind of presentation before. And so, bear with me. I want to go through 4 things, and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. I want to get to how we got to where we are right now. I want to articulate the challenge itself. I want to dive deeper, and then finally reassemble all of this to give us the questions and leading to the questions about the origin stories, okay? So how did we get here? Well, let's start from the very beginning, the elements of the human condition. Joan, you talked about the human predicament. Well, at its most biological level, we exist to survive so we can procreate, all right? I mean, my parents are scientists. They look at the world in a very scientific way. And so what I look at is I thought the best person that articulates this, and this goes to my view of myself as an aggregator. Maybe a good way to say this, I don't have any original ideas. In a sense, what I do is I take other people's ideas and I put them together, and maybe something else comes out of that, okay? So one of the things that I thought about, that I thought Yuval Harari, and I'm going to cite books that are probably much more in the common, in the mainstream, okay, as a way to illustrate this, is, so with that as its basis, what we do to combat early death so we can make sure our children survive is dealing with threats. That's what civilization has done for centuries, right? And those things are starvation, preventing starvation or dealing with starvation, disease, and violence, right? Harari talks about that. So the story then, as you move forward, is that it took a little while for us to figure out how to deal with that, with combating early death or premature death, okay? But we humans, because of our creativity, wanting more, right? The ability to collaborate and pass on knowledge from generation to generation, which is, I think, unique to humans in its scale, we've done pretty well. And one of the books that I just read, which I thought was fascinating, and someone had recommended this to me a while ago, and I finally read it, was Vaclav Simel's Transitions. Okay, I thought that was a really interesting way of describing the world, which talks about how humans succeeded. So as a result, we increased our population because we were able to just survive longer, and we increased our food production. We have newer and more efficient energy, and we have a booming economy that gives us a little bit more comfort and the ability to live longer. Okay, but this success, as we all know, and this is not new, has created an incredible amount of stress. And one overarching problem is stress on our planet. And so we have our growth and our progress, and however you want to describe it, is environmentally unsustainable, okay? So the fundamental problem that we face now is, and why don't we go ahead and put that slide up, okay? So here's what I keep on, I have this drawing on my desk right in front of me. And I think that the stripped down version of what the challenges that face humanity sums it up right here in this PowerPoint. And it's essentially a way of showing that the human condition and what we do and how we do it is accelerating faster and faster, right? The things that I just talked about, that Vaclav Simel talked about, and others have been talking about for many, many years now, is accelerating because of technology and just, aggregation of knowledge is accelerating faster and faster and faster. And the institutions that we have in order to deal, that have traditionally dealt with the stress that is created by that, is way behind. So the circumstance is that we have this huge gap. Now, for me, that is why, in my mind, I am doing what I'm doing. I think, in a sense, this is what you all are doing. All right. The idea is that that gap is what I think governments, nonprofits, civil society, and even the private sector need to work to try to narrow. Okay, that is why I think civil society and nonprofits exist. Okay, so to address this challenge of the gap, right? You think it would be easy, right? It'd be easy to figure out a way to deal with that. Okay, once you know what the problem is. But you know, here's the one thing that I learned, I will say, when I was at the Asia Foundation, right? People in Asia, you know, people in Asia who are developing, who are trying to improve the predicament, I mean, the circumstance of their people, they know what the problem is and they know what the solutions are, right? I mean, we have scientists, we have people telling us all the time what we need to do in order to solve the problems that exist there, right? The leaders of all these countries, they're not stupid. They know what the right thing to do is, more or less. And they know that gridlock is bad. They know all the things that we see is really bad, but they won't do it. And why is that? Okay. So that's what I'm thinking about these days, right? You know, that's the level, and that's the thing that I'm thinking about is, why aren't people doing what they're supposed to do? And what I think about is the incentives and the way things are structured are no longer working in the way that they're supposed to. Okay, and so when I boil this down to, for me, and maybe it's just because of my background, I think that what this boils down to is essentially politics. All right, I'm talking about politics with a small p. All right, and you know, maybe the idea academically, or whereas, who has the power, who creates the incentives, and in order to determine the allocation of resources, okay? And the powers that be right now are invested in the status quo. And so what we have to be thinking about is, how do we change this? So what I've given you is a very conceptual thing. Let me take this down to a much more humanistic definition about the conflict and the natures that we're going to face. And I am going to quote here Mark Malloch Brown, who is head of OSF right now. I thought what he described, what we're facing right now in terms of our challenge, okay, and the problems that exist right now in a very succinct way. So what he said was that the overarching conflict right now facing the people of planet the Earth for the foreseeable future is between the forces of international cooperation and the forces of nationalism. What you have here, and what he has described, is what I talk about are the players involved. Another way of looking at that are people who believe in the we, right? And believe in obligations to the community versus just ourselves, okay? So he talks about the players involved. That's the nature of the politics that you are going to see. And I would say, my observation is that everything that you're seeing right now in the world boils down to those two forces, more or less, okay? The second thing is, what is the substantive nature of the policy battle that we're going to be seeing? And again, Mark Malloch Brown puts it very, very well. He says, sustaining the world's ability to absorb new people as our population continues to grow and will continue to grow for the next 50 to 100 years, from 6.5 billion to 10 billion people, depending on more or less how we deal with population, is that our world's ability to absorb new people and the ones in difficult circumstances of the world and provide them a decent life. That is the political issue of our time. So here you're defining the nature and the scope of the actual substantive battle. So if I take Malloch Brown's framework, okay, and so now here we are deconstructing a little bit, okay, is how are political battles decided, right? And my answer comes down to, when I think about how are these allocations going to be made, I think about it really does come down to systems of government, decision-making rules within the system. And in a sense, it is what we call, for those of you, within a system. So that's pretty abstract, okay? So let me bring it down to something that we deal with all the time first, and then broaden it out a little bit. So all of us have a computer, right? I don't know what computer you have, but what I think about is you have all these apps, you have all these programs in there, and I'm kind of, if I recall, who did I thought about this, and I remember someone wrote, oh yeah, it might have been Tom Friedman about 20 years ago, wrote something about this, or use somebody else's analog. We talk about operating systems, right? It is, whether you use Windows, Apple, or Android. Your computer doesn't work unless you have an operating system, right? And so in the world of politics, I would argue, okay, that the analog for that, for the operating system, about how politics and how resources are allocated, in the 20th century, it was a battle between fascism, communism, and really liberal democracy, or market economy, or however you want to describe it, as a means to describe politics. Those were the battles of the operating system then, right? And so that then leads me to this particular thought. Okay, the current circumstance right now is that, so we know that fascism lost in World War II, communism lost in 1989, and then democracy was supposed to be the end all be all, the end of history, as Frank Fukuyama talked about, right? Now the problem is that a lot of people prospered, and I come from Ohio. I come from a small town in Ohio. I'm in contact with a lot of people in Ohio. My wife comes from the Central Valley. There are a lot of people there that waited in the 1990s and early 2000s for that prosperity that happened for a lot of people to come to them. And it didn't happen, all right? And so what you're seeing now, as we talked about politics, investment in the status quo, is that, I think you all have been talking about the efficacy of Western liberalism and democracy is being challenged by many because it has failed to address the problems that currently exist for many, many people. And people are looking for alternatives. So how does that manifest itself now? Well, internationally, whether we realize it or not, there is an alternative system emerging, okay? I'm not saying that, and that is a rising China and its system. I'm not saying that the Chinese are intentionally doing so. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, I don't know. But you have people who are basically talking about China in that terms. And to quote, here's what someone said, in terms of that part of the world, the Pakistani prime minister who just lost, Imran Khan, talked about the communist China is a unique alternative model, parallel to the electoral democratic system. China has basically, and I'm paraphrasing, has introduced an efficient system of sifting talent and grooming it, which is much more remarkable than electoral democracy. That's pretty interesting. And I think a lot of people are talking about that, about China in that way, okay? Domestically, we see what's going on with Trump, MAGNA, offering a kind of alternative. It's definitely much more nationalistic, much more autocratic. It's about getting things done no matter what. And for a variety of reasons, it's compelling to people, right? And for those of us who are trying to push back on Trump and the anti-democracy forces, there is one huge problem that exists now that hasn't existed before to the scale that it is now. It is the phenomena of fake news and the questioning of basic facts. Now, that is really hard to deal with. So when we deconstruct the polycrisis and rearrange it into its subparts, I've argued here that the key component of this is politics, all right? So let's talk about then what those questions are and how we can arrange those parts and how I'm starting to think about things in that way. So what can we do? So I would say going back, and remember what I said at the beginning, not fighting the old war and hoping that you can go back to the status quo. I don't think going back to the old way we did things is going to be possible. All right, there's just too much that has happened. And we need to deal with a completely new world, and we can't rely on what worked before to work again. And I think that we have to start thinking about the idea, we have to start accepting that the perception that is growing stronger and stronger and stronger throughout the world, that Western democracy, Western liberalism, and capitalism needs to change and is failing. Okay, so that's nothing new. I know you all are talking about that. But my question to you, okay, is, and I know that a lot of you are probably thinking about, what is that new vision, okay? What is, I would say, using the computer languages, what is Western liberalism 2.0? What's the upgrade, okay? So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that. I have no idea what that is, okay? I have some elements here that I can answer questions, and if I have a little time, I can talk about it. But I want to spend a little more time for people to be thinking to talk about this, because I want to hear your answers. And so, you know, assuming we figure out what that is, all right, once we have a new vision, we also have to develop a new story to communicate that. Now, I always used to think that communication and public affairs was sort of, you know, most of us who, in most of what I found, most of the people in the world who work in the world think about that as you know, public affairs as an afterthought. They think of a policy, they put it together, and then the public affairs issues and the communications issue come at the end of the process. I have come to believe that that has to be at the very, very beginning, particularly now, when information is disseminated so very quickly. So as we think about what the new story is, or we think about what the new vision is, we have to start integrating the new story, the new narrative to sell this upgrade system, okay? And the reason why narrative is so important is because most people don't act on facts anymore. They act on emotion and connection and community. So that's what's really interesting that I've sort of, I realized is that we are uniquely human. What is uniquely human is that culture, myths, and stories. You know, it's the notion of how do you get 1 billion people to agree to what is essentially a conceptual framework that is not tangible, but a set of rules that everyone will agree to and work with, right? I mean, that's remarkable if you think about it. We have 6 billion people who more or less agree and are working on a common set of rules, right? And the reason that happens, I mean, I think about North Korea, right? You have a completely different system, but they have an origin story. They have the idea of how things came about, and people buy into this, and they move all forward in the same direction. So kind of like herding cats, right? You all are going in the same direction, or you're trying to, okay? So when I look at this as, you know, one way, the thing that most people will probably relate to is, I see this as, so if you believe that everyone is competing, okay, and we have China that is talking about their way of doing stuff, all right, here's what Xi Jinping said in September 2021 at the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is a fundamental achievement of the CCCP. We've developed socialism with Chinese characteristics and driven coordinated progress in material, political, cultural, ethics, social, ecological terms, and have pioneered a new and uniquely Chinese path to modernization and created a new model for human advancement. Now, I know why Xi Jinping has done this. He's trying to herd 1 billion people to try to deal with their problems, which are significant. Now, I have no idea if he intends to take over the world or he wants to become the dominant power of the United States. I mean, you know, there are a lot of, we can have arguments about that, right? I don't know what Xi Jinping is actually thinking, nor the leadership. But what I'm saying is that they are presenting an alternative narrative here that is very compelling to a lot of people, okay? So that then leads me to the second question that I think that we have to be thinking about and worrying about, and what we need to be putting some of us, okay, not all of us, putting some real hard time to is, what is that alternative narrative? Okay, and this is where I don't have any answers right now. Okay, I'm hoping that some of you have pieces of that we can then start working together to figure out what that is and how we start disseminating that. Because whether we realize it or not, we have the technology and the world that we live in now will allow some of this happen, to allow, once we get the right narrative, to start disseminating in a way that I think many of us can't really even imagine. So that is what I see as, for me, is probably the most difficult and compelling challenge that we have right now. And again, let me underscore that it's not, let me underscore, this is not the only problem, right? We've got so many things that, but I believe that we can, walk and chew gum at the same time. And if you're looking for, all of you are looking for a place where I think there are things that are underfunded right now, and where there needs to be a place where people need to put some real effort in a very intentional way, this is it, okay? So let me then end, as I said I would. Okay, and wow, this didn't take as long as I thought it was. I thought I was going to talk and not leave enough time for all of you to be to start thinking and exchanging ideas. I asked you what the difference between mess and messy is. Okay, all right. Now, whether you realize it or not, okay, whether you realize it or not, all of you believe the world is messy, okay? So why is that? Okay, you're here, all right? You are here listening to me right now. If you believe the world was simply a mess, you would believe there's nothing that we can do, okay? It is just so far gone. It's a hopeless cause. I'm walking away. I'm not going to be thinking about any of these issues, okay? By being here, you believe the world is messy, it's complex, it's difficult, right? But it can be saved, okay? So that is why I'm doing what I'm doing. That is why I, in my job, that is why I'm here speaking with you, because I want to find people and I want to connect with people who believe the world is messy, but that we can do something about it, and that each together and in the aggregate will make the world a much better place and make it the world that we want it to become. We may not succeed in our lifetime, but we have to set the foundation for that. And so, as I've sort of argued here, and the question that I'm presenting to all of you to be thinking about is, what is the narrative? Okay, and if we can do that, then you start working backwards. We can then start organizing people and herding all those cats in the direction that we need to go. But right now, I think we're losing that challenge, because other people, with democracy failing, and the perception of democracy failing and not living up to its promises, people are filling in the gap, and I don't think we've come up with one that has been compelling enough at this point. So, Michael, Joan, Stanley, with that is my presentation. Okay, I have no idea Whether it is useful or not, I have no idea. If it's one in which you've already heard all of that, if it is, I'm sorry. But those are the issues that I've been thinking about and have been trying to grapple with and trying to find like people to help me with. So thank you.
Philip, thank you so much. I just want to call everybody's attention to the chat where we're getting great comments. And by the way, the chat is an autonomous parallel dialogue, so we won't be able to bring it all in. But there's so much good stuff going up there. You know, Jonathan Cloud, I would say the story is collapse and renewal. The question is, what kind of renewal? Paul Growald, has there ever been a unified story behind the world being messy and difficult that is accepted by most human beings? And then there's a reference to the Nordic secret work, which is really interesting to us. We actually have a project on that. And then Christine Muller, we need to develop spiritually, which is a strong position. And then there's a good deal on Václav Smil's work, which we are close students of, as many of you know. He's Bill Gates' favorite scientist, and he's a skeptic on the energy transition. He argues that we're not going to make it, whereas Amory Lovins and the folks at Rocky Mountain Institute believe we can make it. So that's one of the critical issues. Philip, where I would really like to start, when you asked if that was a useful presentation, I would say it's fairly stunningly useful. And no, it's really excellent. And what I would start with a fundamental challenge. You said the world is divided, a good argument, between nationalists and internationalists. Suppose that the internationalist position was quite neutral on Western democracy. In other words, why should we privilege Western democracy as the only system of legitimate government in the world, which it clearly is not in reality right now. But more than that, Robert Kaplan's extraordinary book, The Revenge of Geography, makes very clear that there are a lot of places in the world that democracy has never worked, doesn't work if you try to apply it now, and may never work. You know, so the question of whether democracy is a universal solvent for human organization is a fundamental one. And so, you know, one could make the argument that Western efforts to implant democracy, you know, because we think it's a good idea, have frequently led to worse outcomes for countries. And what about the possibility that the best approach would be to say, you know what, different people in different cultures are going to have to make up their own minds about what form of government works best for them in reality right now, and what their own priorities are for the realization of better governance in the future. And that what internationalism really means, and it sure is messy, is that nobody should try to impose a system of government on another country from the outside. You know, I think that, imagine for a moment that the core issue for our time is not democracy, but it's the fulfillment of human values, which are much broader than democracy. Do people have, you know, air they can breathe, water they can drink, food they can eat, shelter, heat, you know, just the very core things that people need. And so my question to you would be, why should we, in formulating what an internationalist position is, why should we privilege Western democracy above all other forms of governance?
So let me be really clear about that. I think that so my argument would be, let the market decide, right? So that's what we're saying here. Another thing that you're talking about is, and this is, you know, I can give you what I think the characteristics of the solutions are going to be, right? But what you're talking about is the concept, which I think people need to be thinking about more, is the concept of good government.
Yeah.
Right? What is good government?
Exactly.
Right? And I think you're right. I think that it will be the the form of good government will be different for every single country. All right. And what I would say for us here in the United States, one of the things I firmly believe in is leading by example, right? And so if we can get, and that is to the extent that I agree, and there are a lot of things I disagree with, but do agree with the current administration, is the notion of we've got to set the right example. We've got to get our own house in order first. And so that's what I would be thinking about in terms of, you know, and again, I'm in that sense, I'm very focused about the United States in that way. You know, that's what our challenge is, right? What is that variation? And if it succeeds, then we may be emulated in certain ways. And that's the way it should be. We cannot impose it on anyone. What I would say, however, in terms of nationalists versus internationalists, is fundamentally, are you only looking out for yourself, or are you looking out for the community as a whole? With respect to COVID, with respect to COVID as a pandemic, do we just, you know, do we beggar our neighbor? And is that what we want to do? Are those our values? You know, my argument is no, because from an enlightened self-interest standpoint, it's going to come back to bite us regardless. Okay, that is where what I mean about nationalists versus internationalists. Okay, for all of you who haven't, and Bob Putnam, who did Bowling Alone, and I would recommend, if you haven't read this book that he wrote, which recently came out, was called The Upswing. He talks about this as well. What he does is that he takes a look at American history for the last 120 years, and he argues that, you know, if you talk about a time where people were self-centered, where income gap was bigger than it ever was, social unrest, people questioning democracy, you know, he's not talking about 2021, he's talking about 1890s, okay? And what he was able to trace in a very interesting way, using all this big data and previous sources, the notion that our orientation went from, in the 1890s, one being solely about us, we, you know, I, to a more collective we. And it hit its peak in the early 1960s, and then has steadily gone back down again. All right. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of nationalists versus internationalists. Is it an I and only my country, or is it everyone else?
Absolutely. Just along these lines of, you know, what is good government, which I think is a much better frame. I just think the Biden line that it's the democracies against the authoritarians, first of all, it's completely inaccurate. You know, there are a number of, you know, India, for example, is not lining up. And secondly, if we move to a good government model of respect for, you know, diversity of approaches, we might not be looking at the world the way we do, and we might be looking at it in a much more fundamental way based on what is good government for different communities, and how do we get to the internationalist perspectives you're describing. Joan Diamond, thoughts and reflections?
Well, there's a lot of very rich sort of questions and comments in the chat, and I'm not too sure exactly how to bring those in, but maybe as we all think about how to bring them in, whether it's just reading them and letting you respond, Philip, whether you would rather look at the list and see which ones you would like to respond to. But maybe the place I'd like to start, and we've touched on pieces of this. Philip, if you were giving this talk to a primarily Asian audience and global South, where the primary audience were the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, North and South, India, Pakistan, broader global South, are there changes, or are there things you would emphasize, or are there things you feel you would need to sort of frame differently? One of the challenges we've had is really figuring out the language. Maybe it's the narrative as you propose, that does resonate truly globally, given the differences and increasing differences in, you know, the world?
Yeah, one is, again, Michael, you're absolutely right. We cannot be perceived as imposing anything on anyone, right? That is never going to work, okay? The other thing that I point out is, unfortunately, narratives are never accurate, okay? That's one thing we have to accept, right? So we're gonna have to fudge a little bit, okay, as we try to figure out what this universal narrative is going to be. And we're going to have to figure out how to adjust that narrative for particular countries, right? And so, Joan, it's hard for me to say what I would do for the global South or for Asia because it's so diverse, right? But I do think that as I'm, and I'm riffing here a little bit, right? There are things about good governance. It is about, basic human liberties, right? It is this combination of collective and individualism. You have to appeal to self-interest, okay? Because if people are allowed to be as creative as possible with limits, you are going to produce and create things in a much, much better rate and faster rate than you would in a society that limits those. I think those are the things that you want to be focusing on, right? So as I think about, maybe I don't, again, I don't have the answers. What I can tell you is we have to figure out what, going back to my private equity venture capital hat, I firmly believe in two things that are going to have to happen. So this is not the answer, Joan, that you're talking about, but I can tell you what we should be doing, all right, to facilitate that, to get those answers. One is we have to experiment like crazy, right? So for all of you funders out there, use a venture capital model if you can do that. You've got to seed a lot of different ideas. All right. And there are characteristics of, because I've been a funder too, right? About what that looks like and what you should be looking for. So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's got to be local. Because that's where you can get the most done most quickly and use it as a proof of concept. And then if you design the project in mind for scalability, which is ultimately what you want, then it can be disseminated. And one of the things that you can do, and here's an idea that I would love to do if I had the money, is to create as many different networks and nodes around the world to be able to share that information. So, I have this idea of creating a central clearinghouse for cool ideas, for proofs of concepts that have actually worked locally that people can access, right? That's what at World Affairs, what we, as I was telling you, Michael, and I'm not pitching this, but this is something that, we don't have to do this, but this is what I like to do. This is my life's work, is that, the new public, the public platforms that we have in the past for the old world were simply one way. You get a bunch of experts coming in and telling you what to do, right? And we know, in the nuclear world, you have people who are what we call the nuclear priests. And they would tell you, this is the way it is, and this is what you got to do, and go, and that's it. Give us the money, and we'll take care of it, right? That doesn't work anymore, right? What we're doing at World Affairs is we are now saying that people are yearning for action. All of you are yearning for action. And so we are creating a platform for that to happen. We're going to allow all of you to actually we're going to curate stuff, and we're going to allow you to start taking something that you think is meaningful. So here's where I think what you need to do is I can tell the process, okay? Here's the other thing. Most people say, what is the most important innovation that has occurred in the world, right? Is it the computer? Is it the press? Is it this? Someone has convinced me of this. Maybe it's because my father is a scientist, is a physicist, my mom is a biochemist. The most important human innovation that has ever occurred is the scientific method. Okay? From that everything springs forth from. And the scientific method, if you take that, is based on experimentation and verifying and then moving forward and disseminating it. That's what I want to do here. I think that's what we can do here. Okay, so those are the two things, Joan: experimentation, make it local, and the third thing is create a central information bank that people can take it and do what they want with it. And it doesn't cost anything. Okay, it's open source.
That's brilliant and looks very helpful. The only thing I would add or question is the importance of failure. That when you seed something and start something, the metric can't be success.
Right.
And I think that needs to be part of our conversation.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely.
As an expert in failure.
So there you go. So those are the 4 characteristics that we just talked about, right?
Right.
Everyone can see what didn't work and why.
Right. And that the learning there.
There's so many good comments in the chat. Let me just introduce one fact from one of the good parts of my life where I've spent a lot of time at Commonweal with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment looking at endocrine disrupting chemicals. And the complete toxification of the entire biome is overlooked because of the climate emergency. But nonetheless, the toxification of the biome is an extraordinary fact. And one of the consequences is declining sperm counts, which are declining rapidly. A woman named Shauna Swan, a colleague, Dick Jackson was on this call, one of the actually key scientists who worked on this at NIEHS on endocrine disrupting chemicals. But there's a very real crisis in human fertility, and sperm counts are going down, as is female viability for pregnancy. So the assumption that we're going to be dealing with a world of 10 billion people is not necessarily the case. And one of the things about the polycrisis is that it constantly surprises us. You know, we have these environmental, social, technological, financial, economic, global stressors interacting with increasing velocity, creating outcomes that are totally unpredictable, and future shocks of ever greater magnitude at ever greater frequency. So all our ideas about how the world is going to look are basically up for grabs because, you know, there's so little that we can predict in it. So I guess one question for you is, that's how, quote, we see the world, this idea of these interacting global stressors. We have a list of 20, 30, 40 under those categories. The total unpredictability, the increase in future shocks, and so on. Is that allied with how you see the world, or do you have a different model of what's happening?
Yeah, I completely agree. And so that's why, you know, that's why you experiment. That's why you have, it's very decentralized. That's why it's local. Because at the local level is when you're going to start detecting sort of these of what's to come. And if you have a repository or a way for someone to communicate what's happening in one part of the world that may have applications, to know that you can start pulling all this together. So yes, completely. I mean, you know, no one knows what's going to happen. The other thing I would say, quite frankly, is that one of the things that I firmly believe in too, and I think this has been borne out by, you know, Bob Putnam. Bob and I are on a board together. Bob's book, you know, Upswing, is the idea of one common element and a solution is young people. I'm not talking about teenagers. I am talking about not someone my age, all right? I'm talking about people in their 20s and 30s. They're the ones who are going to find the solutions. They're the ones who are going, if we give them the opportunity to experiment, they're going to come up with some stuff that will be responsive to whatever happens, and creating the resilience I think you're talking about.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the chat here. First of all, Philip, you can just pick something if you'd like to. But Alex and Sabina say a promising new narrative is the great transition see the Great Transition Network's website and Paul Raskin's book. Jonathan Cloud says, see Earth Regeneration. You're all invited. Jonathan Cloud says, I don't think we can let countries decide how they want to be governed. We need to get rid of countries, focus on bioregions. Government will only work in the long term if it is actually by, for, and of the people. Yeah, that reminds me of Randy Hayes' vision of North America specifically as a network of bioregional economies. And so there's a whole school of thought, which Jonathan Cloud is describing, that we have to get rid of countries, which will be, here's the Upswing book, How America Came Together by Putnam, a wonderful resource, Governance Befitting Humanity in the Path Toward a Just World Order. So there's just a lot of great commentary. Philip, is there anything you'd like to pick out to respond to, or further comments before we ask more questions?
No, I mean, I kind of agree with everything, there's not much here that I can really, there would just be certainly just quibbles more than anything else. I think though, again, I want to underscore when I look at this is, like I said, everyone knows what the solutions are, right? They do. Everyone knows what you need to do. The question then boils down to politics, right? And if you're pessimistic, we're not going to get our politics, then basically things will fall apart. And then you have ideas about how to regenerate, right? And those will be applicable, right? But I'm talking about process here, and I'm not a process guy, right? But I am talking about the operating system here. So how do we align incentives and put together, approaches that realign incentives in a way that's going to get our politics unstuck? Because I think it's unrealistic to scrap everything. What you've got to do though is figure out a way to get things unstuck. And if they don't get unstuck, well, here's the other way to look at it. Okay, I'm somewhat, fatalistic, or, if you think about the world as a competition between China and the United States, right? Nothing's inevitable. I don't think it's written in stone that China's going to keep on rising, nor is it written in stone that the United States is going to be continuing declining. I don't think that's the case. I think what is going to happen is whoever gets their act together more quickly is the one that's going to succeed. Both have serious problems, right? And all this is grounded in their own politics internally. Now, and so that's what I think is the big thing that we have to focus on is our process here, getting our act together and getting things unstuck, and thinking about what those levers are going to be.
I think you would get no disagreement in the United States on that. Linnea Lombard, who's thought a lot about this wonderful organization called New Stories, says, speaking of the networks of different ideas, these networks are already happening. Everyone I know is creating new platforms to link up new ideas and what's working.
So lovely.
Again, Christine Muller, we need both a just global governance and empowerment of people at the grassroots. The latter was explored recently at the annual conference of the International Environmental Forum. So many good ideas happening. There's a very interesting conference about to take place in Austin, Texas, which I encourage people to look at, called Emerge. And it's run by a group out of Europe called Perspectiva. And they have a very interesting European voice on these issues, which is very dialogic along the lines that you're describing, Philip. So, by the way, we will capture all of the chat and send it out to everybody. So that's great. The case. Joan, do you have additional thoughts or questions?
No, I mean, I, of course, have an endless list of questions to pursue over time, but, not for right now. I'd really like to thank them, and not only Philip, which we will do again, but
No.
many, many really thoughtful and useful comments in the chat of other organizations, initiatives, what people are finding useful. And I think that that's a valuable resource for the future. And Philip, as you look at the sort of umbrella clearinghouse, however you describe it, for some of the thought leaders, there's some good ideas here.
Dick Jackson, who ran the major unit at National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, says the epidemiologic counterpart of the polycrisis is syndemic. All our public health medical challenges are deeply knotted together, as Paula reflected above. To untie the knots, we must examine their origins. One thing we haven't talked about, because there's so many different future scenarios, and some of them obviously are, sort of create a hospice for the earth. We're in environmental grief. All we can do is grieve. And then there are others much more hopeful. Nate Hagens is such a good example with his podcast series, The Great Simplification, and his basic theme of bend, not break. So there are a lot of people who believe that we're in at this bottleneck of evolution, and part of the creation, part of humanity may make it through. The question is in what form, right? And we don't know whether, if humanity makes it through the bottleneck, whether what makes it through will be human or post-human or human with Chinese characteristics or whatever. In other words, human, but with an incredibly different ideology about how we treat each other. And if it's post-human, then do the post-humans treat humans as a subordinate species? I think one of the key resources as we've worked in this field is science fiction, because science fiction creates an immense variety of imaginable worlds for us to look at, so it doesn't get binary, about one force against another. Reflections, Philip.
Well, those are all, I don't disagree with any of that, but here's what I would say. If all of us, there are some of us, or if we hold the core values of what liberal democracy represents, okay, and to me it's tolerance, it is the scientific method, it is allowing people to reach their full potential, it is self-determination, okay, and it is restraint, I think, right? If those are the things that are most important to us, whether I call that liberal democracy or not really doesn't make any difference to me, but those are under threat right now. And so we have to do something about it, or at least try to do something about it. So that's what I'm focusing on, right? And that's where, to me, the rubber meets the road, and that's where what I want to be doing for the remainder of my working life, to see what we can to make sure that happens, because that's who I am.
And do you mean that not only in the United States, but wherever it's possible?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But they have to determine that, right?
Exactly. Well, I think that's a wonderful point to begin to bring this to a close. Joan, other thoughts or comments?
No, not right now. But Philip, thank you very much. I mean,
this is
this conversation.
Yeah, and I want to thank all the people who've contributed to the chat. This has been, really a superb conversation, and the richness of the chat, combined with the clarity and depth of thinking that Philip has offered us, we're moving our thinking forward. we're having the kinds of conversations that we need. And Philip, we would love to collaborate with you as you develop your thinking from your base, just to explore how we can continue these conversations.
Yeah, so if we can be at World Affairs a platform for some concrete experiments, bring it on. We'd love to try to look at it again, local. Let's try it here. We have all these different ideas that are rather small and some are bigger, but this is something that we want to try to do. And my job is to make sure that we are able to find the resources and create the platform in order to do all of this. So thank you for being willing to all of you to be part of this journey.